The Story Witch by Kaye Booth from the Once Upon an Ever After Modern Myths and Fairy Tales Anthology, published by WordCrafter Press in 2022. Deep in the darkest part of the forest lived a witch named Tabitha, who spun stories as well as spells. They called her Tiny Tabby when they thought about her at all, because she was so small that she lived inside a large toadstool which grew from the rich dark earth at the base of the oldest sequoia tree. Tabitha chose to make her home there, far away from the rest of the world, where she could be left in peace to write stories and weave spells. The world had not been kind to the wee witch, who was small enough to need to dodge between feet on the busy city streets to avoid being stomped by bustling people in too much of a hurry to even notice that she was there. And so she had retreated to the depths of the forest, where the birds and beasts of the forest seldom ventured, and the sun rarely touched the pine needles layering the forest floor. While it was true that it was dark and musty, she was seldom disturbed from her writing. After a field mouse who had been chased by a fox ran up her toadstool one day and perched in the eaves of the cap, nibbling at the edges in an attempt to make a meal of her cozy little home, she conjured a cat to chase off any unknowing creatures who might wander this far in. Most days went by with Tabitha writing her stories undisturbed, taking time out only to eat and feed the cat, who spent most of its time curled up in her kitty bed by the fireplace. Tabitha had given it food and named it Puss, and because mice seldom ventured this deeply into the forest, Puss had become somewhat of a lazy cat, growing plump on rabbit stew made from the catch of Tabitha's snares, which were always full, due to the enchantments she placed upon them. Most of Tabitha's magic was woven into her stories, which were wonderful tales of adventure and daring. Day after day, her enchanted keyboard typed out her words as she paced from one side of the toadstool to the other, dictating the stories that came into her head. One after another, she stacked the completed stories in a box on the corner of her desk until eventually the stack reached the ceiling and overflowed into a new stack on the floor, and then another and another, until there was only a small space left around her desk, and she had to clear a path to the fireplace so she could keep the fire ablaze to hold the darkness at bay and keep her little toadstool warm. Finally, she was forced to stop pacing and dictating, as there was no room left in which to stack her pages. Something had to be done. If Tabitha wanted to continue writing, and she did, writing stories was her favorite thing to do, then she had to find a way to clear out the old and share them with the bigger world in order to make room for the new. She knew just the spell that would accomplish the task for her. So Tabitha set out into the forest to gather up the ingredients that she would need for that particular spell. A pinch of wolfsbane, 7 caps of an unusually rare mushroom only found in the darkest patches of the forest where sunlight could not penetrate the canopy of the trees, a handful of hogsworts, which are not all that easy to get because wild hogs are slippery and not likely to give their warts up without a valiant fight, and the whiskers of an enormous catfish which lived deep down on the very bottom of the lake. She had to wrestle him into submission, since catfish are rather fond of their whiskers, and once plucked, they do not grow back. Now, most of these ingredients were quite difficult to obtain, which is as it should be, since magic should never be easy. If spells were simple to cast, everyone would be conjuring. No casting spells is an art, and they require both skill and talent, like any other creative endeavor, along with a certain amount of acquired knowledge. But the last step in this particular spell was the hardest, calling for all the ingredients to be mixed together and heated to a boil by the breath of a dragon. Tabitha did know of a dragon, Zarg, who lived in a cave deep in the heart of the mountain. She wasn't on good terms with him after she distracted him with a mock attack on his cave long enough for her to snatch a few dragon scales from the floor of his lair where he'd shed them. That wouldn't make her task any easier. Zarg was a smart dragon who didn't take kindly to being made to look a fool. He wasn't likely to have forgotten Tabitha's trickery. Nevertheless, once she'd gathered together all the ingredients she needed, she set off toward the mountain, drawing the fireproof cloak that her grandmother had made for her around her tight to ward off the chill that the deep shade of the forest brought with it. As she made her way through the darkest part of the forest, the fireflies she'd summoned lighting the way, it was her good fortune to come across a rabbit which had been lost within the forest depths for so long that it hopped around blindly, with no way to find food or protect itself from forest predators, of which Tabitha was only one of many. Everyone knew the way to the dragon's heart was through his stomach, so Tabitha built a fire and cooked up a lovely rabbit stew to offer up in apology for deceiving him. There was no guarantee that it would work, but Tabitha believed her chances were good, so she took extra time to search out the most delicious ingredients available to flavor her stew just right. When the stew was done, she continued on her way to Zarg's cave, where she hoped she could convince the big flying lizard to cook up her spell with his breath.